It's news to me that this past weekend, El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele, made a very controversial proposal to Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. It's essentially, he said, we have these 252 people who happen to be Venezuelans in our jail, most of them associated with gangs. If you give us 252 of your political prisoners, we will give you back these 252 Let's get right into what's going on. This story is all over the place. Check out some of these headlines. Bukele offers to swap 252 deported U.S. migrants for Venezuela's political prisoners. El Salvador's Bukele offers to swap Venezuelan gang members for political prisoners. And then this one right here, which I thought was really interesting. Venezuela says it can't accept El Salvador's migrant prisoner swap offer until it gets documents. That last headline is key because it shows the Venezuelan side kind of rejecting it without fully rejecting it. And there's a reason why they want more information before moving forward with something like this. Because it's pretty bold for El Salvador to just say, hey, we have these 252 people, we'll give you 252 of yours. Oh, by the way, we don't have any formal diplomatic relations with Venezuela. We're not even technically on good terms. But hey, yeah, let's just do a prisoner swap. You know, sometimes when you see headlines like this, you think, oh my God, are we going to go back to like the Cold War era where the United States and the Soviet Union would trade spies and people back and forth? Yes, that does happen still today. Like there was actually an article in the New York Times about this in July, about how the US and Russia traded these two people, these two spies, but generally speaking, prisoner swaps aren't done between countries that aren't on good terms. And yes, you can probably argue that the United States and the Soviet Union weren't on good terms. They had their differences, but there was always that understanding that if one of their citizens got arrested in another country, they would try to work it out. In this case, the US and Russia worked it out, whereas El Salvador and Venezuela have no formal diplomatic relations. Now, the big question you might have after reading this is like, wait, who are these people? Who are the people that El Salvador is offering to swap? And the answer is, well, these are people who have been in jail for years and years. They're saying that they're part of violent gangs. And in particular, they're talking about a gang called Trendy. Now, Trendy Aragua is originally from Venezuela. It's a gang that started in the early 2000s, but it migrated to El Salvador around 2012. And it became increasingly violent. So much so that in 2015, El Salvador actually launched an anti-gang crackdown called the War Against the Gangs. So as a result of that, a lot of these gang members fled to other countries. They were able to flee to other Central American countries, or Mexico, or even the United States. But the gang itself remains active to this day, and they've been linked to all sorts of violence. And apparently, some of these gang members were deported to El Salvador from the United States. And according to President Bukele, there are 252 of them in this one jail called the Second Prison, which is a high-security prison. Now, President Bukele gave this proposal on Twitter, as he often does. And he said, quote, we are ready to make a humanitarian gesture by releasing immediately the two Venezuelan migrants detained in El Salvador if the regime of Nicolás Maduro releases the same number of political prisoners in Venezuela. And he added, we demand the freedom of the Venezuelan opposition activist, Regino Llanes, Maria Samano, Rafael Romero, and all the relatives of the Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, who were arbitrarily imprisoned in Venezuela. Now, that's the thing. He didn't just say, hey, we'll give you 252 people for 252 of your people. He specifically mentioned several people who are close to the Venezuelan opposition, who have been arrested by the Venezuelan government. So the idea here is we will give you back the 252 Venezuelans in our jail. If you give us back these 252 people that you have arrested, and he mentioned quite a few names. Some of them include relatives of the opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, along with activists and people sheltering in the Argentine embassy in Caracas. Now, I don't know a ton about this situation in Venezuela. It's not the country I'm most knowledgeable about. But as far as I understand, this Maria Corina Machado is a very prominent opposition figure in Venezuela. She is one of the people who is considered a potential successor to Juan Guaido. Who was the guy who declared himself the interim president of Venezuela in 2019, when the country was having its crisis, when there were protests everywhere, and there was this fight over whether Maduro was the real president or whether Gaddafi was the real president. Anyway, she's one of the top opposition figures in the country. Her family has been targeted by the Venezuelan government, and her family has played a key role in pushing for the recall referendum against Maduro. So that's a little bit of background on her. And then by extension, her family. The response from the Venezuelan Foreign Ministry was that it rejects and repudiates the statement from Bukele, calling the detained migrants kidnapped and asking for official documentation. And that's the key part right there. They're saying we need more information. Why are these people in jail? Are they actually Venezuelan citizens? And then the Venezuelan government added that, quote, Venezuela reaffirms its willingness to continue working for the integral protection of migrants and refugees, in accordance with the principles of humanity, in compliance with international law and the spirit of regional integration. So basically, the Venezuelan government rejected it. But they didn't flat out say no, we're not interested. What they said was, we need more information before we move forward. And it's interesting because this comes at a time when the United States and El Salvador are coming under a lot of scrutiny over their handling of migration. The U.S. has been deporting a lot of people to El Salvador, even though El Salvador has said repeatedly that they're not able to take in all of these people. And now you have this situation where El Salvador has taken a very controversial step, putting themselves in a tough spot by saying, hey, we're willing to release 252 people from jail if Venezuela gives us 252 of theirs. And yes, they're on opposite sides of the political spectrum. El Salvador is very much pro-government, very much doing the government crackdown, whereas Venezuela is considered anti-government. You know, the activists, the opposition figures. But El Salvador is saying, hey, if you give us these people, we'll give you these people. What is the logic behind this? Well, the logic is that El Salvador is looking out for El Salvador's interest. And the way they're looking out for El Salvador's interest is by saying, hey, we're not just going to keep letting the United States dump people off here. And yes, these are people who are associated with gangs, who are apparently dangerous, but they're also people who are a burden on the country. At the end of the day, El Salvador doesn't want to be seen as a dumping ground for people who are dangerous. And they're hoping that by making this proposal, hey, maybe Venezuela wants some of these people. We'll give them to you. And then all of a sudden, the pressure's off El Salvador to deal with these people. So if you're sitting there thinking like, why would they do this? Why would they put themselves in this position? Well, it's because they want the United States to stop sending them problematic individuals. So now the United States is going to be watching this very closely, and El Salvador is hoping that Maduro says, hey, we're interested in 252 people. We don't care if they're pro-government or anti-government. We want them. Then all of a sudden, the United States isn't going to be able to send anybody else. And yes, that's probably wishful thinking on El Salvador's part. But again, this is the best way that they can protect their own interests right now, because the United States has largely ignored them. This story is developing. Things are going to change. We're going to follow it. Let me know what you think. Should the United States be using El Salvador as a deportation center? Or should they find some other country? Or do you agree with El Salvador here? Do you think they're trying to look out for themselves? Let me know what you think. Comments below. As always, thank you guys for joining. We'll be back soon.